Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Feed My Mind podcast. And as always, thank you for tuning to this frequency. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Anthony Ross and I'm passionate about two things in life: bringing out the best in others and having a curious, open mind. In this episode, I chat with Dr. Andrew Lemon. He's an entrepreneurial osteopath starting his own injury rehab clinic right here in Melbourne, as well as co-founding Movement Assessment Technologies, which is now the #1 educational provider in the world for evidence-based, objective movement assessment and rehabilitation. It's really amazing. These educational tools have actually found their way across the globe into some of the most prominent sporting organisations in the world, including the AFL, Socceroos, PGA Golf Tour, ATP, and Cirque Du Soleil, just to name a few. We had a really great in-depth discussion about the human body, particularly from a holistic perspective, how it functions, understanding pain and its evolutionary response to threat, as well as the importance of the psychological factors involved in helping clients thrive. I'd like to give a special thank you to local Melbourne artist Hawaii 94 for that beautiful song playing in the background. All right, it's time to feed your mind. G'day everyone, welcome to the Feed My Mind podcast today, and I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Andrew Lemon. So Andrew, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Roscoe.
No worries, thanks for joining. So you're a doctor of osteopath or osteopathy. So if you could maybe just give us a brief introduction of who you are, sort of what you do and why you do it, just so we can sort of set the background for listeners.
Oh, that's a big, wide-ranging question to start off with. A good one to start with. So I'm an osteopath by trade, one of the directors of the Injury Rehab Centre, which is a physiotherapy and osteopathy clinic in Cheltenham, and also one of the co-founders of Movement Assessment Technologies, which is an education organisation, as well as, product innovation, kind of organisation too, particularly in the healthcare space in terms of quantifying movement data and being able to develop tools and equipment to be able to help us individuals in the healthcare space kind of provide that.
It's a very, very exciting assessment tool for looking at obviously a range of physical capabilities, which we'll go into a little bit later in the podcast. So if we'll just start off with your education, so a little bit of a background of sort of what you studied, where you studied, what you got out of that.
Yeah, so I started seems like a while ago now. Undertaking studies in osteopathy and completing a master's in that, and that was at Victoria University here in Melbourne, and then really that kind of set me up, I guess, in a career as an osteopath. But I guess for me, it was one of those things that I wanted more, and I wanted to kind of investigate more ways in which I could further my skill set in being able to help people and be a real problem solver when it comes to the human body, help people kind of achieve their goals and get back to the things that they want to be able to do. And that led me on to a year-long study program actually over in the United States with the Gray Institute. And they're a group that have been around for about 25 years or so, who really specialise in looking at different forms of movement assessment, particularly, I guess, the three-dimensionality of movement, and how we can start to use different techniques and different systems and processes to be able to develop better movement in the people that we work with, whether that be for injury rehabilitation or even performance enhancement.
That's fascinating. So I just want to find out a little bit more about this fellowship that you've got and studying overseas. So tell us a little bit more what this Gray Institute sort of, where is it? What do they stand for? And how did you, I guess, end up studying overseas?
So the Gray Institute are located in Adrian, Michigan, which for me, that was the first time I'd been over to the United States, and to kind of make a beeline straight for Adrian, Michigan was probably an unusual first encounter into the US. We're talking, very much kind of middle America, and everything that comes with that. But these are guys who have been, I guess, real thought leaders in the movement space, as I said, for a long period of time, 25 plus years. Guys who have developed a lot of kind of fitness and rehabilitation products that you might have seen kind of around, in different gyms and things like that. Like if you've ever encountered some of those big true stretch cages, kind of things like a Dyna disc, which is like a balance board type tool. These are things that these guys have kind of been developing for periods of time that are kind of all around. But they've also been teaching, kind of some of their methodology and their ideas for a long period of time too. And part of that includes this gift mentorship program that goes for about a year or so, and includes 3 kind of gatherings over in the US during the 12 months. And it was, for me, I went across there thinking that I was really going to, just absorb a lot of really great information directly, from the actual, I guess, the curriculum of the program. But I mean, what ended up actually being the interesting finding from it was that because it's a mentorship program or a program that brings together, hundreds of people from around the world, from lots of different backgrounds. We had people from the Seattle Seahawks, in the NFL. We had guys from Everton Football Club, physios that were working on the PGA Tour, as well as just amazing other health and fitness professionals from around, all over the US and Europe. Getting a bunch of people like this all in, the one space, for usually a pretty intensive week of, kind of learning and interacting and discussion and things like that. I mean, that was the best part of it, right? Like the stuff that I learned directly from the Gray Institute was great, but the things that I took away from the people that I interact with all the time was even better. And, I've maintained a lot of these relationships even to this day, which is, continued to, I guess, push me and my development of things that we do here in Australia even further.
So with any sort of key insights that you found from, I guess, working and having exposure to some of those sort of, other people that you said, the working in those professional sort of sporting organisations, I guess some of the, what we would probably consider in Australia, like some of the elite, you look at, the high level physical capabilities of, say, someone, like you said, the Seattle Seahawks versus your typical AFL football. It obviously requires a completely different skill set, different thinking, different training. I think
here's the fascinating part. I mean, often here in Australia, we look outside and look at these big organisations, multi-million-dollar organisations, multi-million-dollar athletes, things like this. Actually, when you start talking to these guys, we're probably ahead of the curve. So I thought that was really refreshing to kind of understand that, and the renown and the, I guess, the reputation that we have here in Australia from those individuals over there is really, really high too. So even though these guys have huge amounts of money to play with, they're still not necessarily more advanced than us when it comes to, particularly, I guess, looking at performance, injury rehab, things like that. In those sporting environments. So that was probably one interesting thing that I really took away from that. Probably though, the thing that really came to me from interacting with all these guys though, and all these different people were, I guess, the importance of not being stuck in terms of how we address different issues, whether it be from an injury rehabilitation standpoint or a performance aspect. I mean, at the end of the day, they're really just two different sides of the same spectrum, right? So, the things that apply maybe for that high-level strength and conditioning coach actually are really applicable for, for example, for myself as a therapist, as someone who works with people with injury and dysfunction. In the same sense, though, as well, like for those kind of high-level athletic individuals, there's often like a lot of things that we do from a treatment standpoint that might be really apply to them too. So I probably took a lot out of being able to interact more with some of those people from those different fields. So in athletic training, in strength and conditioning, that type of thing. And that's probably then where I then developed, I guess, some of the fundamentals for now how I practice and some of the things that we do today.
I'm just sort of shocked about it a little bit, I guess, when you said that Australia might be ahead of the curve, or is sort of ahead of the curve, I guess, in terms of knowledge and training and our capabilities, which I think's fantastic. Given our size relative and probably research funding compared to some of the organizations and institutions in America. I think that's amazing. So,
yeah, look, I think it really just comes down to, even though these guys have a lot more money, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're kind of pushing the boundaries of what they do. It just means that they spend more money on doing the same things, over and over and over again, in many ways. I mean, look, certainly what it does seem like is that there is a real focus on, when it comes to American sport, in terms of the things that I encounter with the guys that I interacted with, there's a real focus on early specialization over there, right? So what that means is that there are a lot of particularly younger athletes who are really specializing in a sport, and often in a lot of their sports specializing in a position within that sport, right? And so there's a lot that goes on from a strength and conditioning standpoint, or an actual kind of athletic skill development standpoint that these guys are working on, from really early ages. The problem with that, though, is that that's the thing that leads to huge amounts of injury risk, injury issues, in these younger athletes who are developing, that actually cause a lot of problems for them over there. So, they're getting 15-year-old kids who are, squatting and lifting huge amounts of weight, and becoming hugely athletic, but that has its, massive downfalls as well, particularly for those athletes. So if they survive through that process, then it might be a good result. But unfortunately for a lot of them, they really struggle.
I guess with anything, I mean, there's always going to be a trade-off. I mean, the human body's got limits. It's got caps as to what it can or can't do. And I guess, like you said, if you're highly specialized, you're going to excel in so many areas above everyone else. But there's also going to be, I guess, you're going to have downfalls, or there's going to be consequences of, or a trade-off, I should say, in some ways. So we'll go into a little bit more about osteopathy as a whole. So if you're able to explain to the audience sort of what that is and how that differs from, say, physio or chiro.
This is the question that I get, kind of every day, right? So you'd hope that I have a really good, well-prepared spiel to deliver.
I hope so.
I think, look, here's the deal. I'll give you the 2 points. I'll give you first, the one that the majority of people would say, and then I'll give you my one after that. So the one that the majority of the people will say will be that if we look at all the different therapeutic modalities, right, they all kind of stemmed from one point or one individual's philosophy at the time, right? So osteopathy was founded in the Civil War area in the United States by a guy called Andrew Taylor Still. And basically his point of difference at the time was he was really all about understanding and acknowledging the fact that the body has its own inbuilt healing processes and healing mechanisms. And really, as a philosophy, osteopathy is then there to just try and facilitate that. Just try and, help the body do its thing to heal itself in many, many regards. Now, it probably made a lot of sense at the time because this was when, people were kind of eating and injecting mercury and things like that, to try and treat different issues. So he was probably getting great results by just not doing a lot, right? And so if we fast forward to today, a lot of people would say, well, osteopaths are... they look at the body as a whole. They try to understand how different areas of the body can integrate together, and how if you have an injury in one place, well, then what are maybe some of the predisposing factors that maybe contributed to that, and then how can we really enhance, I guess, the way in which you feel, the way in which you move to try and help address whatever that issue is. If we compare that to then things like physiotherapy or chiropractic, traditionally maybe physiotherapy is a little bit more exercise based, and depending on the actual setting, it might be one in which it's more about trying to address an area in isolation to try and enhance that or allow it to handle more stress and strain so that you can get on with what you want to do. And traditionally, I guess chiropractic is more about a philosophy that stems from every issue, regardless of what it might be, might come from the spine in some way, and then we address that. Now, I say this with the caveat that certainly that is a really broad and generalized stereotyping statement. And there'll be many physiotherapists and chiropractors and osteopaths as well that will probably totally disagree with that. Here's now my take on it.
Yes, this is what I want to hear.
My take on it is that it doesn't matter at all. The point is now we're in a period where, certainly when it comes to healthcare, we're looking to the evidence as to what's best practice to help individuals with certain conditions or certain presentations to be able to, achieve their goals and get the best possible outcomes for them. So the point is that whether or not you're an osteopath, a physiotherapist, or a chiropractor, we're starting to see a lot of these practices now practicing in very, very similar ways. Things that were probably traditionally osteopathic in nature, and now, physiotherapists are doing plenty of that, and, lots of osteopaths now are getting into the exercise rehabilitation space and that type of thing as well. So really, it 100% doesn't matter what you are and what you do. The keys here are that, as long as you're kind of practicing in the way with the best intentions for the patient or client that, hopefully has some type of evidence as to kind of why you would do that, that's the most important thing.
That's a perfect answer. That's very, very good. No, I think that's fantastic. I mean, particularly as someone who's obviously working in the medical space and sort of treating patients, to put them number one, because there have been experiences, not only firsthand but also anecdotally that I've heard of. Certain practitioners will obviously focus on their own profession first and focus on themselves first, as opposed to actually what's best for the patient. So I think that's fantastic that you're taking that sort of much more holistic approach, and obviously patient first. And it's really interesting that you said that obviously there's sort of, I guess, more of a dissolving of boundaries, I guess you would say, sort of between the physio, chiros, and obviously yourselves and osteos.
And look, and I think this is the thing that we encounter so much is now everything is individualized. Right, every individual is very different. What they will respond to is very individualized as well. So we need to treat and look after everyone as an individual. And the problem with that is that these kind of cookie cutter approaches to, looking after people from a health and wellness standpoint. Look, the good news is they're being found out. Where once there wasn't necessarily the evidence, to kind of back this in the research. Now it's starting to become, very mainstream knowledge, particularly for us in the health and wellness space.
Now I'm gonna play the devil's advocate here. If I had come from another planet and I was just to say physio, chiro, osteopath, and then have there been any sort of studies that have done comparing, I guess, outcomes? Let's just say, I don't know, what's the most common thing? So say a back injury. Most people have got sort of at least experienced some sort of form of lower back pain in their lives. Have there ever been sort of a comparative studies that look at what it is as a whole? I know you said there's not a cookie cutter approach, but
as in each methodology, what happens. Look, often what it comes down to is, unfortunately, it doesn't come down to like the methodology or the philosophy, right? Because at the end of the day, that's kind of a subjective thought process of the practitioner as to, okay, how am I going to address the issue that's in front of me? What it usually comes down to are what are the techniques or the what's that are actually applied in this case to that individual. So I mean, a lot of the thing, and this I guess is the problem for a lot of people, and I kind of feel for the average punter out there as well, right? Because the point is, if you do have a back issue, for you, it can be very confusing as to, okay, who do I see, right? It's a difficult question. It's a hard one to answer. Do I, chiropractors work with backs. Do I have to go see a chiropractor, or my friends who are an osteopath, they got a good result? Should I go see them? But there's lots of physios out there. Like, where do I draw the line? So it is really hard for them to understand. The problem is though that for a lot of people as well, the thing that they see or the actual interaction they have is just based on the treatment techniques, right? So, and the problem is that there is no technique in isolation that is the be-all and end-all cure. It's the application of these things in a way that has, some type of strategy involved to then try and achieve some long-term outcome. So, I mean, particularly if we just look at treatment techniques in isolation from a research standpoint, basically every treatment technique, for in the research is no better than placebo.
For sure.
That is literally the answer to that point. So it doesn't matter if I do just, a little bit of, kind of soft tissue massage type techniques, or if I, manipulate the spine. You might have some dry needling techniques done. Someone gets taped up, all of these things. If it's just the application of something very external, when we go to the research, it's no better than, literally taking the sugar pill.
And that's gives even more credit to the power of the mind and what it can do in healing the body.
Yeah, well, and this is then, where things get really, really fascinating. I mean, if we think about kind of pain and injury and those type of things, I mean, we know more about pain in the last 5 years than the 500 years preceding it. Right. It's a really fascinating time. And this is where we're very lucky once again here in Australia. We've got, the best pain scientists in the world pioneering this stuff. Actually, down in Adelaide, a lot of these guys are working down there. Some really smart guys by the name of Lorimer Mosley and David Butler. I'd certainly recommend, anyone who has any pain or any issues and has interests in how pain works to kind of investigate some of their work. But what we're really finding here is that, pain is just an output from the brain, and it's an experience that's generated in response to threat or the potential for threat, right? So the point is that this becomes multifactorial, really complicated, but also for us as practitioners, fascinating. And then how do we actually address and start to manipulate this for a positive outcome?
It's really fascinating. And this is I'd like to go into this topic a little bit deeper if we can. When you're talking and explaining about obviously what osteo is as a whole, you mentioned the word holistic, and that's something I want to focus on. I guess much more on that as an approach to looking at the body and treating it that way. But then now that you've just sort of mentioned obviously more the pain aspect from more of a psychological point of view, I want to incorporate that into your answer as well.
Yep.
Because it's probably, like you said, it's if all of our knowledge from pain in the last 5 years that's been accumulated is more than the previous 500, like you said. So I think it's fascinating now that all of this knowledge is now, I don't know how from a coursework point of view, from an educational standpoint, whether that's now being incorporated into osteopath. But I'd just sort of like to get your perspective on the holistic sort of side of it, and now with this new science emerging, how that psychological aspect of it is now being incorporated to treat pain.
I think, look, I mean, osteopaths have always hung their hat on the holistic aspect of how they do things. And I think what that means is that probably, in my experience, from the outset as a graduate of osteopathy, you're probably best positioned to be open-minded to how all the systems of the body interact with one another when it comes to an individual's health and wellness, right? And this makes a lot of sense. I mean, at the end of the day, we're human beings, we're an organism, and, like any organism, we have kind of checks and balances built in place to be able to handle the stresses and strains of life to maintain survival, right? That's like the simple answer to that. So this is where then, I guess, what we're starting to see now is particularly, and it's becoming more mainstream in the research and our understanding, is how all these different systems maybe can interact. We're seeing now and understanding more about how, nutrition and gut health kind of have a huge impact on other areas of, psychological and behavioral kind of wellness. We're seeing how, behavioral and psychological health can have a huge impact on the structure and the physical, right? So, and the great thing is this is now all becoming, well understood. This isn't just someone's kooky opinion anymore. This is like actually becoming fact. I mean, the big problem is that this still isn't necessarily being taught in a very good way in terms of the tertiary structure. But like all these things, it just takes time, and we'll get there in the end. So I think just the point is that if we think about just the function of that human organism, right, there are just lots of components that are involved in it. And often we talk about that kind of biopsychosocial model for healthcare. For us, look, and certainly for me, like the philosophy around a lot of people's health and wellness, particularly because my scope of practice is really within, how do I help people feel better and move better? Beyond that, that's probably someone else's job. But for me, it's a big part of it is looking at the capacity of an individual to tolerate kind of stress and strain. So that's often, kind of strength, conditioning, endurance, things like that. What's their kind of movement skill level like? So basically, looking at the efficiency of someone's movement, whether or not they're a kind of a skilled mover. This kind of comes into, I guess, neurological kind of skill and how they can start to apply that from a movement standpoint. Also looking at then whether or not they have enough kind of movement options. So, being able to develop then once again that movement skill in lots of different ways. Often what we find are those individuals that can kind of get the job done from a movement standpoint in lots of different ways. It gives them that kind of inbuilt redundancy in their movement. If they don't have their best way of moving available for them, they've got another option, right? Which might then reduce their risk of injury or something along those lines. And then finally, the big thing that, I talk about a lot is actually developing an individual's confidence in their movement. This is where we see, particularly in those individuals who've had maybe pain or injury for a long period of time, it can actually be the hardest factor to address. And a lot of that then becomes, once again, about developing all of these different elements. And look, if you're feeling like you're really, really strong and you're moving really well in lots of different ways, you're probably going to feel pretty confident about it as well. So movement becomes a big part of what we do, because we find that at the end of the day, that's the end outcome that people want to achieve, right? It's usually a doing thing, right? People don't really care too much about pain, but they care about it a lot if they can't do the thing that they want and they really love to do because of pain.
No, that's fascinating. And what you just mentioned then was about developing an individual's confidence, and I think that's so critical, because I think the element of the psychological element of healing and living fully is only becoming really sort of fully understood, I think. And like you said, having that, like I had did a podcast last week with Adam Ferrier, who is a behavioral psychologist, and he specializes in advertising. But in there, we spoke about there was a psychological study that looked at the bedside manner of doctors and how they treated their patient in terms of the body language, their attitude and demeanor, and how that itself affected patient outcomes.
Yep.
And I think that's so important, obviously, for medical practitioners, just to have an understanding that even, smiling and saying hello and the effect that can have on their ability to perceive not only your competence, but also their outcomes as a result of that. I think that's absolutely fascinating.
It is. It's huge, and they talk about that as in the expectancy of the treatment. If you don't believe in it, and look, sales is a dirty word in a lot of things, particularly in healthcare. But selling the treatment is actually part of your responsibility in terms of actually helping someone long term as well. So yeah, it's super important. And just once again, it comes down to the fact that often how we think and how we feel has the biggest outcome in terms of pain and injury and whether or not these things kind of progress in a way that's positive. Because we just encounter so often, we talk about it in terms of what is the meaning of chronic pain is basically pain that goes beyond or lasts longer than the physiological healing process, right? And so if we ask the question then, because pain is once again the body's output in response to threat or potential threat, why is there a perceived potential threat still after that strain or sprain is actually healed and is now structurally fine?
It's a fascinating concept, isn't it? Obviously, there's evolutionary roots behind that as to why that's happened. What do you see? How do you keep up to date with what's going on, like with all the latest? I'm sure there's for me personally, I've got a strong interest in nutrition, and that's literally every week or every month there's a different article saying something completely different. So the evidence is so contradictory. So this is obviously your area of in, I guess, the treating the body as a whole, and what's going on in that space? Like, how do you keep up? How do you know what's good, what's bad?
Well, I mean, fortunately, as kind of an educator, you have a duty to stay up to date, which is good, because it does, gives me great reason to keep up to date with the research. I mean, once again, I mean, the great thing now is that there are so many people who are really kind of trawling through the research, kind of coming up with clinical opinion and discussion around, how it then applies to what we do. Now all you need to do is just follow them on social media, right?
Yeah,
and
it's a lot easier.
And that way then you can kind of stay attuned to everything that's going on. I mean, it's the same in healthcare in terms of, there'll be two different pieces of research that contradict each other, every week, that type of thing. So, you've got to be able to sift through all that and be able to kind of find, where things might apply to what we do. And there's a big difference between research and kind of clinical practice as well, right? So it's I mean, I think it's just a fascinating time in terms of, there's lots of research being produced, and there'll be lots of things that we still don't fully understand in terms of that as well. But certainly social media is very, very useful these days, I think, for keeping up to date with research and that type of thing.
There is, absolutely. One thing which I'll get your perspective on, which I just want to see, is with the rise of social media. Like, I follow a lot of physios and exercise people sort of online, and I'm noticing they're posting a lot more videos for people to do stuff themselves.
Yeah.
And obviously that's a two-pronged effect, right? I think in many ways it's great that they're sharing their knowledge, they're getting information out there, but at the same time it's probably risky, because you've probably got a lot of people that are self-diagnosing who may not have that injury but think they've got that injury, and long-term they're probably doing more damage.
Yeah, look, it is a tough one, the old Dr. Google kind of syndrome, as we see. Look, I mean, in many ways, it's amazing in the sense that now more than ever, there is so much knowledge and education around best practice on handling these things than ever before. Where previously you would have had to have gone to consult a specialist or someone who has experience in the field of physiotherapy, osteopathy, something like that, to be able to get this understanding and be taught it. Now it's just available freely online. So I think you're right in the sense that has a bit of a two-pronged effect. One, it's great that people can be educated and understand the things that they need to do to look after themselves. But two, there is also then misinformation and people kind of wrongly applying it. I think, though, for us as practitioners in the health and wellness space as well, the problem with that too is that it means that actually more than ever, a lot of our service is almost a bit redundant, in the sense that a lot of people are finding, I can get a lot of this info just online for free, something like that. So it does cause some problems in many ways in that regard. But yeah, look, I mean, the recommendation is always, look, if you have a problem, see a professional, rather than kind of take the risk and kind of guess about it.
For sure. Yourself. But it's obviously making sure, that you guys are providing, a lot more value as well, and people so not only that you're providing value, but people understand the value that you guys do provide, in the sense that, like you said, you can go to Dr. Google and just say, I've got a back injury, what do I do? But it's having that faith and trust in, I guess, the experienced practitioner to say, well, I've been trained to actually find the right problem and give you the right solution. So I think that's critical. One thing that we touched on before we started recording was about, I guess, the technology and that sort of, and how that's changing the profession. Are we able to sort of go into a little bit of that, of how that's sort of changing and how that's technology is impacting? Yeah.
I mean, it's something that obviously I'm really, really passionate about. It's basically the thing that we've kind of founded a lot of the work that we do with the Injury Rehab Center and Movement Assessment Technologies is all based on how technology can enhance and provide greater value for not only patients, but also for the practitioners who are involved in the health and wellness space. So, I mean, particularly for us in terms of technology, I mean, a lot of where we started was that we believed that the things that we were using were more to help from a clinical, technical standpoint. So, for example, movement assessment technologies, the first thing that we developed was a tool called the MAT, the movement assessment tool. And basically what this is just a simple, easy, convenient to use tool to be able to help measure things like distances, angles, heights of movement. Where that then came into play was, well, that then provided us with a really useful baseline measurement for a certain movement, whether that be a movement of the foot or the ankle, it might be a movement of, through the hips and through the spine, that then could be used to go, okay, this is where this patient's at right now, and now I've done this treatment technique, or I've given them this exercise, and now I can retest and remeasure to see the positive effect that has hopefully had. Because as practitioners, often what we're really good at is the subjective side, being able to look at someone's movement and say, okay, that looks good, that it looks like an improvement there, or it looks like this might be where the issue is. Unfortunately, inherent bias is always a massive problem there. I don't think I'd never done a treatment technique that wasn't a really good one that had a really positive effect. So being able to actually put some objective numbers on it, certainly we found that we were starting to get some better outcomes in terms of being able to identify the root cause of the issue and then actually address that. What we then found though was, and this was probably the unsuspecting part, was that actually the power of using a tool like that, an objective measurement, actually wasn't so much in kind of helping the practitioner from a technical standpoint. It was actually in the communication aspect with the patient afterwards, right? So all of a sudden, rather than having that patient who, the classic case is the individual with lower back pain, they'd come in, you'd make them kind of bend forward and they'd have, they'd experience some of that pain in their back. You'd do some type of treatment technique or something like that, and then you'd ask them to bend forward again at the end of the session, and sure enough, they still had back pain. What we were finding then was actually now starting to use some objective measurements and tools. I mean, you could actually start to communicate very easily. Well, yeah, look, I mean, you still have a strain in your back, but you're now moving an extra, 30% more than what you were before. So being able to kind of have that understanding and something very tangible for the patient to be able to see that, was the thing that actually help develop that confidence in the plan, as we kind of talked about before, and help them be maybe a bit more compliant or buy into that plan going forward, so that they did things like the exercises and stuff that they're supposed to do when they're at home, and not spending the 30 minutes with you in their week just doing that. So, and often it is like, what are the things that they do actually outside of that treatment session, or, what are the things that they're going to do in their day-to-day? They're the things that have the biggest impact in terms of their recovery or making their improvements.
That's absolutely fascinating that you said that. I guess the biggest thing that you've taken away from that is their ability, not only is the communication aspect, but more their ability to track their own progression. You're removing the subjective look at how they think they're going versus looking at the objective measures saying, this is how you're progressing. And there's a lot of psychological research that backs it up, as obviously once you can actually visually see or track your progression and how you're moving along, just that aspect of seeing how you've progressed, obviously, like you said, adds to the confidence, adds to your treatment. And that's absolutely fascinating. So it's really great to see that obviously that's happening. So just for the listeners, because this movement assessment tool that you have built, it's a physical thing. So are you able to just describe sort of what it is, what it looks like, how it works, just so?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple, and it's something that we really created because we wanted one, and there wasn't one. Basically, all it is it's just a bunch of markings, on a floor-based mat that then comes with a measurement ruler type setup to be able to measure, as I said, movement for different angles, different heights, different distances. And it just allows the application of a lot of tests that have been done, once again, and well researched in the literature for a period of time, but in a way that's kind of convenient and easy, and it can kind of roll up and move away. Because, I mean, the big problem for a lot of us as practitioners is we're often working in a very, very small space. And, it can be hard to kind of find the room to be able to apply some of these tools and things like that. So really, really simplistic, but I think that's the beauty of it in many ways. It's, it's simple and quick and easy to use. And they're probably the key criteria when it comes to actually making sure that you're doing the right tests and things like that for the patients and clients so that, you can kind of get on with the actual management side.
That's what you've just mentioned is you've just sort of triggered something in my brain, which I think could be fascinating. Is you said obviously there's been sort of, I guess, a history of any sort of medical practitioner working in very, very small, very confined spaces, particularly with something, I guess, where you're involving the body where you may need space to perform some of these things. I just sort of wonder how much over the last 50, 100 years, treating patients in a small, closed environment has restricted their ability to think about how we can test, treat, and help clients.
I would say it's probably the massive factor. For a lot of practitioners, it can be quite a stifling environment in the sense that really, you're working with individuals that kind of come and go from your treatment rooms, and those treatment rooms are pretty small, and and it can be quite isolating in many ways. Like, for many practitioners, they don't have a lot of other kind of professional interaction with other individuals, just, creative environments in which ideas can spawn. And look, and that's probably then the reason why at our clinic, the Injury Rehab Centre, we, if you walk into that clinic, it looks more like a gym. We need like lots of area to move. We need lots of equipment to be able to test people, and particularly take people to their thresholds, because at the end of the day, like, that's often where injuries occur, right? Like the body's pretty good at, kind of getting by at sub-threshold. Like, things often don't become problematic there. It's just when it gets pushed anywhere near its limits that maybe some of these issues might arise. And so these were like the big problems that we encountered every day as practitioners, in the sense that if all I'm doing is working and looking at someone in a very sub-threshold way, how do I know what's going to happen when they go out and push themselves as hard as they can on the sporting field? Or, if they go and do something that's probably pretty unusual for them, and it's maybe like a once off a year. I mean, the classic thing is you'd think we get a lot of, sporting injuries and stuff like that. The main injuries are, doing the spring clean around the house and around the garden, or that time when you got to kind of paint the roof. That's when all the injuries occur. They're the classic ones.
So you just mentioned about threshold. So how are you, like, obviously as a practitioner and in general, able to know the limitations of someone and then being able to push them to that limit, obviously without them further damaging or increasing their injury risk?
Look, and once again, this comes down to like pain and the body's inbuilt kind of warning mechanisms, right? Like, the brain will stop you from breaking most of the time, right? There might be then occasions where, for whatever reason, things happen too quickly and too fast, and, unfortunately injuries do happen. Or, often a lot of those issues that might arise are often kind of low levels of repetitive stress that go on for long periods of time. And for me, these are literally the two only ways in which injuries pretty much occur. It's literally too much stress and strain for what you can tolerate in a really short period of time. And that's where, you're going to do your hamstring strain or, an ACL injury or something like that. Or you've been doing the same thing that's just a little bit too much more than what you can tolerate, and you've done it for a long period of time. And that's where then those kind of repetitive stress type issues come about. So whether that be just, that really tight, stiff kind of lower back, or maybe it's like a tendinopathy or something like that. So for us at our clinic, I mean, really then it comes down to being able to have tools and equipment to be able to just test what's your strength like. How much range of motion do you have? What's your balance and the control of your body like? How long can you hold a certain position for? So what's the endurance like? And then being able to use tools like force plate systems to be able to measure things like how much, vertical displacement force can you create, so that we can measure how much power you have or something like that. So there's lots of bits of equipment that are out there, and there's plenty of stuff that's accessible and easy to use. The hard part has always been, well, actually, it's very hard to fit all this stuff into a 3x3 meter kind of treatment room. And so, as we said before, then that becomes the really stifling environment. So for us, it was really a case of we opened things up, and then, it was like, okay, well, what toys can we get to start actually kind of applying this philosophy to the people that we work with? And we found lots of really fascinating, fascinating things that kind of, we wouldn't have or weren't able to discover before. And quite frankly, now I don't know how I could actually help anyone if I was stuffed back into a 3x3 treatment room again.
Isn't it amazing how something like that, the environmental factors are actually now shaping the way that you treat patients more so than...
Yeah, I mean, it is almost the most important factor. Like, you create an environment that then kind of leads to outcomes and things like that. Without that environment, it's just very, very difficult. I mean, at the end of the day, you're really just giving people very sub threshold, I guess, just not pushing people enough, or not maybe experiencing enough to be able to really understand what the true issue might be. But also then, I think that leads to that kind of subpar or sub level of healthcare as well, for a lot of people. I mean, how many patients and clients are kind of being given just the most basic, lowest level of kind of exercise or, management techniques or things for them to do at home. No wonder they don't see results, and no wonder they don't keep up with the plan.
No, for sure. So I just want to go back to the movement assessment technologies, which you've started up, and what you call the MAT for assessing people's obviously progression. It's very exciting because I was reading up that you've now got that in over 30 countries, and you're working with 20 plus elite sports teams and across universities as well. So you're able to explain sort of how that's grown and progressed and how it's expanded?
I mean, it was originally a case of, we kind of had some ideas on how things could be done, and maybe once again we were just interested in facilitating the discussion around how could we maybe assess movement a bit better, but also initially how could we create better movement in the people that we worked with as healthcare professionals. So this started about 4 and a bit years ago. And it was originally just going to be something to do on the weekends every now and then, and a good excuse to catch up with some of our professional network and do things like that. And it just became one of those ones that originally it was only going to be about kind of the exercises and things like that. And then, we kind of decided, well, actually we wanted something to be able to measure everything with when it came to developing then the mat, which, the first one was really just me drawing on a yoga mat or something like that. But something really resonated there, I guess, with people. And I think for a lot, it really came down to the simplicity of the objective measurement and, how people were really crying out for that. And they could see the benefit of that tool and how that could apply very easily to the things that they do. Because it's not about reinventing the wheel. It's just about kind of complementing the things that make a lot of practitioners already amazing practitioners. There are a lot of people getting amazing results, and it's just a case of we can enhance that even further. Fortunately for us, then kind of fast forward now, to present day. I mean, it's just something that has continued to take off, and certainly been really lucky in terms of the use of things like social media to be able to get that message out, and people obviously kind of taking that on board all around the world. We have now over kind of 4,500 mats out there. And, I guess it's one of those ones that certainly, I got into healthcare because I wanted to be able to help people. And, it does make me laugh a little bit, and I kind of have a little chuckle to myself when I think like there are all these kind of tools out there that, was something that what was originally just kind of drawn on a yoga mat. It looks a bit more robust now, and it's certainly a much better product. But the fact that these things are out there, hopefully getting better outcomes for people all around the world as well is a really amazing feeling. I mean, we've got. I was kind of looking at some of the other kind of weird and interesting areas that they're out there. Like the other day, only there's a mat in Namibia, there's a mat in the Bahamas, so it's a cool kind of idea to think that there are people out there, being helped by that.
No, that's amazing. I guess you probably never thought that you'd have one of your products in the Bahamas just being used to treat some patients.
I'm hoping it's on a beach somewhere, some guy, is also kind of handing out cocktails and stuff like that. That's my kind of little thought about it.
Yep. And how's that expanded, obviously, to elite sport teams? Because I believe there are a few sports teams that are now incorporating this into their...
Yeah, so the mat's in with the Socceroos. It's in at the Rafa Nadal Tennis Academy. There's, there's some across some of the AFL teams. Look, I mean, it's once again, it's just part of the screening process. At the end of the day, all these teams are looking for data analysis, and data in sport is becoming more and more, such a huge business. And look, I think for a lot of them, we still don't know necessarily what the most important pieces of data are, right? When it comes to injury risk prevention or injury risk assessment, there is still so much more research to be done in this field, and still so much more information to be collected. But definitely for these guys, if you can start to prevent some injuries or get better outcomes with the injuries that you have, that becomes a really valuable proposition for them.
Definitely. And like you said before, you said obviously data is a critical component, particularly for some of these elite sports clubs. And you said that they still don't really know sort of what data they're looking for. I guess part of the challenge that I can sort of see is how do you know, where's your benchmark lie? How do you know what's good? How do you know what's bad? Because everyone's body's different. Everyone's going to have different levels of bone, or their bone structure is going to be different, their genetics, their flexibility, their joint movement. So, where do you even set a benchmark? And obviously it's not really an issue that it presents, but it's more like, well, how do we know what's good and bad?
Well, I think, I think the fascinating thing is also then the level at which some of these teams are kind of looking at different things as well. You can only collect baseline data based off, a big study size, and collecting some of this stuff usually over years. I love listening to Andrew Russell at the Hawthorn Footy Club talk about some of the metrics and the things that they track, and I think particularly when we talk about this holistic element as well, one of the big things that they find is it's not even just the physical data, right? I mean, they take a lot of GPS data on guys in terms of, maybe where their kind of exertional efforts are, in training and out on the sporting field. But often what they find is actually one of the big metrics for, once again, health and wellness is actually more those kind of behavioral elements. So individuals' kind of motivation levels and how they're feeling in that regard. And they actually kind of put numbers on these with self-reported scores, as well as looking at things like sleep data, stuff like that, like how individuals are sleeping and whether or not there are maybe some big changes in that or big decreases. They're the things that they're finding are actually some of the biggest contributors to things like non-contact soft tissue injuries and that type of thing.
So you just mentioned the Hawthorn Football Club. So how did you go about getting your mat into some of these elite sporting clubs? How did that happen?
Look, I mean, fortunately for us, as I said, it's been one of those ones where obviously the message and what we do has just resonated with people. We've done no outbound, kind of communications apart from just putting our message kind of out there, and people just come across us and kind of want to know when are we coming to their hometown, or where can they get a mat, that type of thing. So we've been really lucky. We've just kind of put ourselves out there, and it's been one that people have approached us, but it's allowed us to develop some amazing relationships with some really cool and very fascinating people who are doing a lot of great work all around the world.
No, that's amazing. And I think you mentioned like earlier on in the podcast that obviously I think practitioners are hungry for knowledge. And I think, this is something it's new and exciting. It's a new way to sort of treat, monitor, and measure patients. And I think it's fantastic because I think as part of it, you also run training sessions with the mat.
Yeah, so I mean that's where a lot of it kind of took off. I mean the mat itself was more a tool to help facilitate the education side. So we developed a bunch of coursework that we now have online as well. So we kind of use like an e-learning platform there. So if you want to check it out, go to matassessment.com. But the coursework itself, it covers everything from kind of movement assessment, injury risk assessment, and then looking at techniques and ideas around developing better outcomes through injury rehabilitation as well as kind of performance enhancement as well.
Beautiful. So we'll sort of start to wrap up because we've been going for almost an hour. Just quickly, I just want to touch on some of the basic sort of physiological sort of side of things. Mm-hmm. We spoke before about like how the body compensates for postural reasons, which is obviously an evolutionary thing. Why do you think that is?
Look, I think once again, my view of the body and how it works and those type of things is actually probably simplified a lot in many ways. And I think, we went from a period, particularly in healthcare, where things were very isolated. Like it was, okay, like you have this issue because of this one little component of your body isn't doing what it needs to do, right? And if we come back to this idea and this concept that the body is an organism, that makes no sense whatsoever. The body has a lot of inbuilt checks and balances, as we kind of talked about before. And so the point is that a human body is designed to work imperfectly and do it really, really well. There are plenty of people who get around with massive structural issues, whether that be a joint that's totally destroyed or maybe, they've torn a muscle off the bone and never kind of had anything done about it, yet they're still able to function really, really well. So the body's got a lot of inbuilt redundancy. The problem becomes often in the people that we see is it's when too many things are kind of stacked up against it, right? Like no one issue in isolation is going to cause much of a problem. But if you've got multiple issues, whether that be multiple joints that are maybe not doing what they should do for whatever reason, maybe multiple areas of kind of weakness, combined with then the fact that the thing that you do for 8 hours a day probably doesn't, or it's not conducive to, probably health and well-being. You're probably stressed, you're probably not sleeping well, you're probably not eating well. All of a sudden, these are the things that then lead to someone actually being, in pain, in discomfort, and in distress.
There's so many contributing factors. And I think, like you said before, like now we're understanding more about how the brain and the relationship and gut health and that how influences. And there's all of these factors that are sort of coming together nicely. So I think the medical community and sort of healthcare profession is a very interesting space and it's changing rapidly. And I think it's a very exciting future, particularly for practitioners like yourself that are in that sort of space of helping people. You mentioned before that obviously some of the most common injuries you see from someone that's painting or from cleaning, so is that literally sort of the most common things you see?
Look, 100%, mate. The spring clean, kind of particularly in the garden, if you're kind of thinking about doing that, make sure you go through like a 6-week training block or something just as a pre-season before you get out there. No, in all seriousness, it's one of those ones that it's just that sudden spike in a weird or wonderful activity, right? Once again, the body's really adaptable. It's really good at kind of being able to change itself to get the best out of the things that it does commonly. It's when we throw something new into the mix that often that's where, we might put too much stress and strain for what it can tolerate through. So they're those sudden events. They're usually the ones that get them. And for most people, they're those type of things.
So interesting that like obviously our brain and our body are almost two completely independent organisms. Our brain's saying, yeah, I can go and work in the garden for 6 hours even though I've never done it for 2 years. And all of a sudden the body's like, not working.
That's exactly right.
So what are like the most common, like is it back, is it knees, is it like what's generally from what you see?
Back pain's a huge problem. I believe it's statistically, I believe it's 7% of the world has back pain. So, if someone wants to get the calculator out and do that, I'm sure that's in the millions and millions and millions of people, right? And so the problem is that, once again, a lot of that stuff is still really poorly understood, right? Like, even for all our knowledge and understanding and things like that in health and wellness and looking at back pain, we still don't know why it's so high. I mean, certainly there's a lot of speculation into a lot of the risk factors that are involved. Obviously, people are more sedentary, probably less conditioned. There's a lot of people who are highly overweight, who aren't sleeping well, who aren't eating well. So if we come back to that multifactorial aspect, they're all probably huge contributing factors. Certainly the thing that we see the most of in our clinic is probably just from the conditioning standpoint. For a lot of people who have back pain, it's simply that they have a lot of weakness, and they don't move a lot and very freely, right? Like, so you can imagine a lot of the things or a lot of the muscles and the tissues around the back are designed to kind of hold us in a position. If I'm choosing to be in that one position for a long period of time, it's like try holding a 1 kilo dumbbell out in front of you for 8 hours, right? Like, your shoulders are going to be burning pretty hard. So I think there's a lot of similar things there with when it comes to back pain. So we're finding a lot of people who just undertake a lot of just general resistance training, particularly through the lower limb and through the trunk. They're the ones that usually do the best for those non-specific lower back pain type cases. Obviously, there are cases where there's a really specific kind of cause for it, but the vast majority are more these non-specific types, which just don't have really great reasoning behind it.
Yep. It's fascinating. I was reading an article the other day that was saying the most, like, statistically, they've done analysis, like meta-analysis of the data from, like, nationally and globally as well, and they've found that the most dangerous job that anyone can work is in an office.
Yeah. It's sad. It's sad but true. And like, unfortunately, it's just seemingly going to be more and more, really, and that's the reason why. I think there's certainly some better campaigns and better education around that. Like, I know recently there's a campaign around just getting that general 30 minutes of exercise a day. Like, they're the type of things that are going to make the big difference here, not some special treatment technique or some special kind of tool or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And then we'll start to wrap up. So for you personally, what's your routine like, your physical routine?
Yeah, well...
And how do you try and, I guess, self-monitor to make sure that your posture's right?
I was hoping that you weren't going to ask this question, because this is, unfortunately, I've always been someone who put my own health and wellness as, one of the highest priorities. And this year has been the year when finally I've understand and I've started to feel what some of the patients say when they say, I simply don't have time and things like that. So I'm starting to experience it. So I haven't been very good in recent times. I certainly look to try and improve that. But I think for me personally, it's about having just some general kind of strength resistance training, as well as then just things that are about kind of doing different movements and things like that. So recently, I was kind of getting into a bit of jiu-jitsu and kickboxing, stuff like that. Those type of things are really great for just taking the body into different places, different movements that it wouldn't usually do in an average day to day.
So what have you learnt about your own body then from your experience in obviously all the different sort of training that you've had over the years, as well as your professional training in understanding the body?
Yep. Yeah, look, I think movement is just really important, in the sense that particularly moving throughout the different planes of the body. At the end of the day, we talk about the three-dimensionality of movement. That means that, we have a plane, which is a sagittal plane. That's the kind of forward and backwards plane. You have a frontal plane, which is the side-to-side plane of movement. And then you have a transverse or rotational plane. And so movement is basically the combination of all three of those planes, to achieve a certain movement outcome. Now, the big problem is that for the vast majority of people, they only do things in one plane, which is that sagittal plane, right? So if all you do is kind of lift weights, you're probably just moving in that way. If all you do is run, you're probably only moving in that plane. If all you do is ride the bike, you're only moving in that one plane. So often what we find is that not having that exposure to those other planes can be a big problem. So, that's where things like just undertaking other movement practices, I think, that go into those planes can become important. That's where a lot of people feel like maybe Pilates and yoga are particularly special in that sense. I mean, really, that's just structured exercise that actually goes through those planes. So, I mean, if it's something that you enjoy, that's great. But otherwise, you can, do a lot of that stuff yourself by just really just stretching, kind of and taking those kind of movements through there. So, I think there's a lot to be said about just kind of getting down on the floor and just kind of rolling around, moving around, really.
No, couldn't agree more. And do you have any advice for sort of either people that are currently in the profession or wanting to get into the profession from your experience so far?
Yeah, I think it's the beauty of this profession is it's a really, really rewarding one in the sense that you actually see the direct relationship of your work and the people that it affects. So for me, that's always been the biggest, the biggest reward from it all is the fact that you get to see it firsthand. So it's fantastic in that regard, and particularly if you have a passion for helping people and being involved in health and wellness, then it's a great place to be. It's going to be an interesting time as well in the sense that there's more and more health care practitioners and people involved in health and wellness than ever. And I'm really looking forward as well to seeing how the next generation, who are pretty driven and pretty ambitious in the way in which they go about things, how they're going to continue to innovate and take this profession even further.
Well, hopefully, one of the legacy, there'll be a few mats, few mats floating around.
Hopefully so.
Yeah. And if you could give advice to your younger self, what would it be and why?
That's always a good question as well. I think for me, it would be to make the jump and take the risks earlier. Really, there were a couple of interesting circumstances that led me to kind of all of a sudden having to kind of fend for myself a bit and kind of start up my own clinic and kind of pursue some of these other things. But, it's one of those ones that there's never been a better time to kind of pursue your own passions and, kind of take on the risks and the undertakings that will lead to, a purposeful and meaningful existence.
And yourself, where do you see yourself in the next sort of 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, another good deep question there to finish off there, Roscoe. That's good.
All good.
For me, once again, it's about continuing to pursue this idea of, how can I help more people, achieve the outcomes and their goals. I mean, that's where it all came about with, undertaking studies in terms of becoming an osteopath. That's the thing that drives us with movement assessment technologies is how can, our influence affect even more people. So I certainly see myself continuing to do that, continuing to innovate, continuing to educate and continue to work directly with people. Maybe I just might be in a different location, that's all.
Beautiful. You never know. And obviously for people, where can they find you? So to find obviously more information about the movement assessment tool as well as your own practice.
Yep. So the clinic, we're based in it's the Injury Rehab Centre based in Cheltenham in Melbourne. You can check us out there at just injuryrehab.com.au. You can find all the information about the services that we offer there. And the mat and movement assessment technologies, just need to head over to matassessment.com.
Beautiful. So all of those links will be in the show notes. So Andrew, thank you for your time today. It's been fantastic and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks again, Roscoe.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to tune into this episode with Dr. Andrew Lemon. I'm very grateful and appreciative that he was able to share his wisdom with us today. And one of the things that I found the most interesting about this episode was the impact of having an open space for screening and treating clients, not only from the physical range of assessments that can be done, but also from the psychological factors. I thought that was really interesting. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe on your app and share to as many of your friends who you think might be able to benefit from it. I'm always looking for ways to improve this podcast and make it a better experience for you, and I would be extremely grateful if you write a review on your app and share your thoughts with me. If you like the podcast and want to know some more information, you can head to our website at feedmymind.com.au or check us out on social media. We're at Facebook at feedmymindau, Instagram at feedmymind, or you can follow me personally on Twitter, and my handle is @AnthonyGuy. As always, thank you and stay curious.